The morning Zara Williams chose kindness over her future. She had no idea that a single decision would bring a helicopter to her grandmother's crumbling front yard 3 weeks later, but as she stood in her tiny bathroom mirror at 6:47 a.m., hands trembling, while trying to tie back her thick curls, all she could think about was the organic chemistry exam that would determine whether she'd ever become the doctor her late mother had dreamed she'd be. Zara was 21, a senior at Morrison State University, and she carried the weight of her entire family's hopes on shoulders that had grown strong from years of working double shifts at Rosie's Diner while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. And this exam wasn't just any test, it was the final hurdle before her medical school applications would be complete. The one thing standing between her and a legacy that felt both like wings and chains. She kissed her grandmother's weathered cheek on the way out, grabbed the battered backpack that had survived 6 years of schooling, and stepped into the autumn cold of Philadelphia's forgotten neighborhood, where broken streetlights and boarded windows told stories that never made the news. The bus was late, as always, so Zara walked briskly through Elmwood Park, a shortcut she'd taken 1,000 times, her mind racing through chemical formulas and molecular structures, when she heard a sound that didn't belong in the 7 a.m. silence. A desperate, rattling cough followed by a heavy thud near the park's old fountain. She should have kept walking. She had exactly 42 minutes before the exam hall doors closed, and Professor Chen had made it clear that there were no exceptions, no makeups, no second chances. But Zara's feet betrayed her logic and carried her toward the sound, and that's when she saw him, an elderly man, maybe 70, collapsed against the fountain's stone base, his face ashen and twisted in pain, one hand clutching his chest, the other reaching toward nothing. Sir, can you hear me?" Zara dropped to her knees, her backpack hitting the ground, her fingers immediately finding his pulse weak, irregular wrong end. The man's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain but startlingly aware, and he whispered, "My heart, pills, briefcase, and Zara saw it then. A sleek leather briefcase lying several feet away, where he must have dropped it. She ran for it, tore it open, found an orange prescription bottle, checked the label. Nitroglycerin, and helped him place one under his tongue, her pre-med training kicking in like muscle memory. Then immediately pulled out her phone to call 911, her other hand monitoring his pulse, her voice steady and clear as she gave the dispatcher their location, described his symptoms, requested immediate cardiac support. The man's breathing began to stabilize, color slowly returning to his brown skin, and he looked at her with eyes that seemed to see past her worn jacket and scuffed sneakers into something deeper, and he rasped, "You, you should be somewhere, you keep checking your watch, And Zara's heart lurched, because she'd glanced at her phone. Against 7:23 a.m. 19 minutes, until her entire future closed like a door she'd never be able to reopen. "I have an exam," she heard herself say, "but you need help, so I'm staying." And even as the words left her mouth, she felt something inside her crack and reshape itself. Because this wasn't a heroic declaration, it was terrifying. It was potentially life-destroying, and yet she couldn't imagine making any other choice. The ambulance arrived at 7:34, and the paramedics took over with professional efficiency, loading the man onto a gurney. And he grabbed Zara's hand with surprising strength and said, "Your name, I need your name." And she told him, "Zara Williams," and he repeated it like a prayer. "Zara Williams, I won't forget, And then they were lifting him into the ambulance, and one of the paramedics, a kind woman with silver hair, said, "You probably saved his life, honey." That was good work, but Zara just stood there in the empty park as the siren faded, staring at her phone's screen, 7:41 a.m. And she absolutely knew it was over. But she ran anyway, sprinted the remaining 6 blocks to campus, her lungs burning, her vision blurring, and burst into the chemistry building at 8:03, to find the exam hall doors closed and Professor Chen standing guard like a sentinel of broken dreams. "Ms. Williams," he said without warmth. "The exam began at 7:42. You know the policy." And Zara tried to explain, words tumbling out about the man and the heart attack and the ambulance, but Professor Chen just shook his head, unmoved, and said, "I'm sure you had your reasons, but I have 240 students and one standard. The makeup exam isn't until January. You'll have to wait." And the world tilted because January meant her medical school applications would be incomplete, meant a lost year, meant explaining to her grandmother why the lights might get shut off again, why the scholarship money wouldn't come through. Zara walked to the library in a daze, sat in the back corner where she used to study with her mother before the cancer took her, and let herself cry not dramatic sobs, but silent tears that felt like grief for a future that had slipped through her fingers while she was trying to save a stranger's life. The next 3 weeks were a blur of numbness and necessity. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, avoided her advisor's calls, couldn't bring herself to tell her grandmother what had happened, just moved through each day like a ghost haunting her own life. And she tried not to think about the old man, tried not to wonder if he'd survived, if her sacrifice had meant anything at all, or if she'd just made a naive mistake that would define the rest of her ordinary, unlived life. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, exactly 23 days after the incident, Zara was helping her grandmother plant winter pansies in their tiny front yard, a patch of stubborn beauty in front of their weathered row house, when her grandmother suddenly stood up straight, her hands shading her eyes, and said, "Baby, ... is that what I think it is?" And Zara followed her gaze to see something impossible. A sleek black helicopter descending toward the empty lot across the street, wind whipping the fallen leaves into frantic spirals, neighbors emerging from their homes with phones raised, and Zara's heart hammering with a wild, unexplainable hope. The helicopter landed with surprising grace, and the door opened, and the first person to emerge was the old man from the park, except he didn't look frail anymore. He looked commanding, dressed in an elegant charcoal suit, walking with purpose, and behind him came two other people, a young woman in professional attire, carrying a tablet, and a man with a camera. Zara stood frozen, dirt on her knees, a pansy still clutched in her hand, as the old man walked directly toward her with a smile that transformed his entire face, and he said, "Zara Williams, I told you I wouldn't forget." And her grandmother whispered, "Lord have mercy, who is this man?" And the old man extended his hand, first to Zara's grandmother, with old-fashioned courtesy, then to Zara, and he said, "My name is James Richardson, and your granddaughter saved my life." The next hour felt like a dream. James Richardson, who Zara suddenly recognized from news articles and business magazines, founder of Richardson Technologies, philanthropist, one of the wealthiest self-made billionaires in the country, sat at their small kitchen table, drinking the sweet tea her grandmother insisted on making, and told them his story. "I was in Philadelphia for a private hospital board meeting," he explained, his voice warm and genuine. "I'd dismissed my driver because I wanted to walk, to remember what the city felt like when I was young and had nothing, and my heart conditions, something I've managed for years, chose that morning to remind me I'm not invincible. When you stopped, Zara, when you missed your exam to help a stranger, you didn't just save my life medically. You reminded me why I started my foundation in the first place. Because kindness shouldn't cost the people who can least afford it." He paused, and Zara saw emotion flicker across his face, something raw and real that had nothing to do with wealth or power. "I made some calls," he continued. "I spoke with your professor, with the dean, with your academic advisor. Don't worry. You're not in trouble, and I learned about your mother, about your work ethic, about the future you're building against impossible odds. and I realized that what happened that morning was a test, but not the kind administered in an exam hall. He nodded to the young woman, who opened her tablet and turned it toward Zara, and what she saw made her hands fly to her mouth. A full scholarship to Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, housing included, living stipend provided, starting the following fall. Professor Chen has agreed to give you a makeup exam this Friday, James said gently. And whether you pass or not, though I suspect you will, this scholarship stands. Because what I saw in that park was the kind of doctor the world desperately needs. Someone who understands that medicine isn't about formulas and test scores. It's about choosing human life over personal advancement every single time. Zara couldn't speak, couldn't process the magnitude of what was happening, and her grandmother stood up abruptly, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Sir, I don't know what we did to deserve this kindness, but my daughter's, Mama, she's looking down right now and she's singing. I know she is." And James Richardson stood too, and his own eyes were wet, and he said, "Mrs. Williams, I grew up 3 miles from here, in a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore because they built a highway through it, and when I was 12, a teacher, a black woman named Mrs. Patterson, stayed, after school, every day for 6 months to tutor me in math because she saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. She died before I could pay her back. Before I could tell her that every success I've had was built on the foundation she gave me, and I swore that if I ever had the chance to be someone's Mrs. Patterson, I would take it, no matter what." The emotional weight in the room was almost unbearable. 3 people from different worlds united by the invisible threads of sacrifice and recognition. And Zara finally found her voice and said, "I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because he needed help. Because that's what my mother taught me, and I'd make the same choice again, even knowing what it cost." And James smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and replied, "That's exactly why you deserve this chance. Zarya, don't see your kindness as currency. You see it as responsibility, and that's the rarest thing in the world." But he wasn't finished. He explained that he'd also established a scholarship, fund in Zara's mother's name, the Patricia Williams Medical Scholarship, which would support 5 students annually from underserved communities, pursuing healthcare careers. And he asked if Zara would help select the recipients each year, to ensure that her mother's legacy of compassion would ripple forward into countless lives. "And one more thing," he added, almost shyly. "My foundation is funding complete renovations for this house, new roof, new heating, electrical upgrades, whatever you need, because no future doctor should be studying by flashlight, because the power's unreliable." And Zara's grandmother actually laughed through her tears, and said, "How did you know about the flashlight?" And James just winked and said, "I make it my business to know the truth about people worth knowing." Before he left, James Richardson did something unexpected. He asked Zara to walk with him back to the helicopter, just the 2 of them. And as they crossed the street where neighbors still watched with wonder and disbelief, he said, "I need to tell you something that's not in any press release or official statement. When I was lying in that park, in genuine pain and genuine fear, I had already been passed by 3 joggers who didn't stop, who saw an old black man on the ground and kept running, and I had made peace with dying there. Had actually started thinking about my regrets and my failures, and then you appeared, this young woman with everything to lose, and you didn't hesitate, you didn't calculate, you just acted. And in that moment you gave me something more valuable than life. You gave me hope that the next generation might actually be better than mine. That maybe all the work and money and influence I've accumulated might land in hands that will use it right." His voice cracked slightly, and Zara realized that this powerful man was, in the end, just human. Just someone trying to make meaning from chaos. "I don't expect gratitude," he continued. "I expect excellence. I expect you to work harder than you've ever worked, to become the kind of physician who sees patients as humans, rather than cases. And someday, maybe 20 years from now, I expect you to find your own Zara. Some young person making an impossible choice between ambition and compassion. And I expect you to show up for them the way I'm showing up for you, because that's how we change the world, Zara. Not with grand gestures, but with chains of recognition. One saved life at a time. They had reached a helicopter, and he turned to face her fully, and he said, "Your mother would be so proud of you, not because of where you're going, but because of who you already are." And Zara, who had been holding herself together with pure willpower, finally broke and embraced this stranger who had become something like family, and whispered, "Thank you, thank you. I promise I won't waste this." And he whispered back, "It's not possible to waste it, because you've already proven who you are. Everything else is just paperwork." The helicopter lifted off minutes later, and Zara stood in the middle of the street with her grandmother's arm around her waist, watching it disappear into the Philadelphia sky. And Mrs. Williams said quietly, "Your mama used to say that kindness is never wasted, even when it costs you everything. She said it comes back in ways you can't predict, and Lord, baby, I never believed it quite like I believe it now." And Zara nodded, unable to speak, feeling the full weight and wonder of how a single choice made without calculation, made simply because it was right, had transformed not just her life, but her understanding of what life could be. The next few months unfolded like a story she was both living and witnessing. She took the makeup exam that Friday and scored a 97, the highest in the class. She accepted the Johns Hopkins scholarship at a small ceremony where James Richardson gave a speech about the new generation of healthcare leaders. She helped interview candidates for her mother's scholarship fund and saw her own younger self in their determined, exhausted, hopeful faces. She watched her grandmother cry tears of joy when the construction crew arrived to renovate their house, making it warm and safe for the first time in 20 years. But the most profound change was internal, invisible to cameras and ceremonies. Zara had always worked hard out of fear of poverty, of disappointment, of letting her mother's death mean nothing, but now she worked from purpose, understanding that her gifts were not just tools for personal escape, but responsibilities to a world full of people who needed someone to stop, to kneel down, to choose their life over convenience. She started volunteering at the free clinic in her neighborhood, spent her Saturdays teaching science to middle schoolers who reminded her of herself, and began to see medicine not as a destination, but as a practice of continuous choosing, every single day, to value human dignity over everything else. James Richardson stayed in touch, not as a benefactor, but as a mentor and friend, calling every few weeks to check in, to share articles about medical ethics, to tell stories about his own journey from poverty to power. And in these conversations, Zara learned that wealth and success hadn't protected him from loss, loneliness, or doubt. They had just changed the scenery of his struggles. And she began to understand that the truest measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you gave away, who you lifted, whose potential you recognized when everyone else walked past. On the 1-year anniversary of the day she'd saved his life, James Richardson didn't send a helicopter. He came alone, in a simple car, and took Zara and her grandmother to dinner at a quiet restaurant. And over dessert, he told them that he'd been diagnosed with advanced heart disease, that his time was limited, and that he'd spent the year putting his affairs in order. And he wanted them to know that meeting Zara had given his final chapter a meaning it wouldn't have otherwise had. "I've funded hospitals and research centers," he said, his voice steady, despite the devastating content. "I've written checks with many zeros, and none of it has felt as significant as watching you grow into your calling, Zara. Because you're not a project or a charity case. You're proof that the world still produces people who choose right over easy. And that's the legacy I want to leave, not buildings with my name on them, but people like you in positions to change the system from the inside." Zara's grandmother reached across the table and took his hand, This dignified woman, who had survived poverty and loss, and decades of invisible labor. And she said, "Mr. Richardson, you've given my grandbaby a chance that will echo through generations. But you've given me something. You've shown me that my daughter's teachings weren't foolish. That raising Zara to value people over success wasn't setting her up for failure. It was setting her up for this, for a life that matters. And I'll carry that knowledge with me until I see my Patricia again." And in that moment, the three of them, connected by chance and choice and the mysterious mathematics of compassion, were not billionaire, student, and grandmother, but simply three human beings who had touched each other's lives in ways that transcended transaction. James Richardson passed away 8 months later, and Zara spoke at his memorial service to a room full of industry leaders, politicians, and celebrities, and she told the story of the morning in the park, her voice clear and unwavering, and she said, "James Richardson could have had me fired for being late, could have forgotten my name by lunch, could have sent a check and called it charity. But instead he chose to see me, to invest in my humanity, to trust that kindness recognizes kindness, and in doing so, he didn't just change my trajectory, he changed my understanding of what success means. It's not about reaching the destination unscathed, it's about stopping for people along the way, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you, because that's when your choices reveal your character. And James taught me that character is the only thing we take with us when everything else falls away." Years later, Dr. Zara Williams, a resident at Johns Hopkins Emergency Department, specializing in cardiac care, would tell her interns about the morning she missed an exam to save a life, and she would see in their young, ambitious faces the same calculation she'd once made, the same tension between advancement and service, and she would say, "You're going to face moments when the system tells you to keep walking, when stopping means sacrifice, and no one can make those choices for you. But I can tell you this, the patients you remember, the ones who change you, are never the ones you helped when it was convenient, they're the ones you chose when it cost you something." Because medicine at its core is not a science of perfect decisions, but an art of imperfect love, showing up for strangers as if their lives matter as much as your own ambitions. Because they do. They absolutely do. She established a free clinic in her old neighborhood, funded partially by the foundation James Richardson had left behind and partially by her own growing income, and she named it the Patricia Richardson Clinic, honoring both her mother and the man who had recognized her mother's teachings in a single act of compassion. She never forgot the feeling of her knees hitting the cold ground in Elmwood Park, the weight of the choice, the terror of the consequences, and she never forgot the sound of a helicopter landing on her street, bringing with it not just opportunity but affirmation, proof that the universe sometimes, not always, but sometimes, rewards people who choose love over logic, service over safety, and other people's lives over their own carefully constructed plans. The story spread quietly through her community, then louder through social media, then into classrooms and churches and dinner table conversations, becoming one of those rare modern parables about what happens when kindness meets recognition, when sacrifice meets grace, when a young black woman's split-second decision to stop creates ripples that touch thousands of lives she'll never meet. And on difficult days, when the emergency department was chaos and death seemed to win more rounds than life, Zara would step outside, look up at the sky, and remember the impossible sight of a helicopter descending into her neighborhood. Remember James Richardson's words about chains of recognition. Remember her mother's quiet insistence that kindness is never wasted, and she would walk back inside, ready to make the choice again, to stop for the next person who needed stopping for, to build the kind of world where helicopter rescues aren't necessary because we all choose to see each other, to value each other, to recognize that every single person deserves someone who will kneel down, check their pulse, and say, "I'm staying, I'm here. Your life matters more than my exam, more than my convenience. more than my fear, because that's what it means to be fully human, to doctor with your whole heart, to honor the legacy of everyone who ever stopped for you by becoming someone who stops for others, again and again, until stopping becomes not a sacrifice, but a reflex, not a cost, but a calling, not the interruption of your real life, but the point of it, the whole beautiful, difficult, worthwhile point of it.